So like this is going to be about artist experience, like which is a book written by American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey. So like the background on this is basically America has only one genuine philosophical school. I mean, I don't want to say only one because it's a very powerful one, and it's called pragmatism. And it was sort of like towards the mid to late 19th century and like early 20th century. And like the philosophy has sort of been, when you know, I read like, you know, you might have heard of William James, who's like a very prominent pragmatist. John Dewey, in terms of the pragmatist, is like the most known for aesthetics. So this book, Artist Experience, was written in like, I think the 30s, around that. It began as like a series of lectures, and it's been a very influential on modern art. Like, there was a guy named Alan Caprow who, like, you guys ever heard of the term happenings? You know, like in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and they like revolutionized art. Anyways, like Alan Caprow took his main inspiration from Artist Experience. So like the influence of this book is quite significant. And that being said, aesthetics has you know, there's been aesthetic commentary since then. The postmodernists kind of like Adorno, like the Adorno and stuff like that. It's different from this. So this is, I just wanted to present you with a perspective, because I feel that like when I was reading this, like you can read a lot of art criticism and history and stuff, but a lot of the art theories, they don't all necessarily lend themselves to creation. A lot of them lend themselves to analysis and deconstruction, but not all to creation. I would think that this book is one of the ones that lends itself to creation, because in a way it's very practical. This is one of the good things about the American pragmatists. Like all their stuff is quite practical. If I'm talking too fast, just let me know. I tend to talk fast. So, sort of like the motto of like this whole talk is, you guys watch True Detective, you know, that show with Matthew McConaughey, Woody Allen. Anyways, there was one scene where they're trying to figure out the identity of the killer, and you know, basically one of the main characters, you know, he says something that's super insightful, and he's basically saying that like the killer exhibited like vision, and vision is meaning, and meaning is historical. So like it kind of connects like the idea of artistic vision with history. I don't know why I bring up a serial killer kind of like example here, but like I think the quote is quite apt. Like vision, you know, being an artist now, especially in the time of like when we're doing new media and we're progressing beyond the traditional arts of painting, sculpting, and all that. Like what is art now that it's been released from its traditional like medium, you know? And I think art since the 1950s, since abstract expressionism, really like since it started to become conceptual, it's really about the vision of the artist, like what in particular the artist sees, and like how like that sight is expressed. So this talk is really about that sight and how like the meaning in that, like what is meaning really, and how meaning is, you know, used by, how it's created and how it's used by an artist in a work of art to connect with an audience. So in the last flyby I did in like, I think it was November, I did chapter 1 of this book. So this workshop is going to be on chapters 2, 4, and 5 basically. But just to sum up, like, you know, just to quote, I don't know if I should read all this out loud. To give you a summary of what chapter 1 said, it's like art works because like he starts off at the most fundamental basis. You know, there's the world, there's the environment, and then there's a creature that exists within the environment, okay? And the creature, if it adapts to the environment, it survives. If it does not adapt, it dies. So, like, the cycle of existence is such that the creature goes through periods of positive adaptation where they adapt to the environment, and adaptation and times when the environment changes so that the creature is no longer adapted and the creature is threatened with suffering and death. And it's this rhythm of adaptation and loss of adaptation that sort of like the creature is sort of stuck in. So John Dewey's theory is that like what art is, why we feel emotion when we see art. First of all, he thinks that when the creature goes from one end of the spectrum to the other, from adaptation to maladaptation or the reverse, emotion is one of the things that are evoked. And emotion is sort of like the things that prompts you to do stuff. It's kind of like your guiding action. So emotion is like a part of our survival mechanism, because emotion basically leads us to do stuff to survive. You know, and when you think about you know, like the reasons for your, you know, improvement in life or lack of improvement, a lot of it's due to setback and like things that you learn based on those setbacks. So how art works is basically like when you are disunified in some way, and we're all disunified in some way, at least to very lesser degrees, you project that disunity into the external objects of the outside world. And when that projection hits a piece of art, that art was formed with the artist's own projection of their own disunity. So in a way, it's like you find a common chord in that disunity in the work of art. And the way the work of art reconciles like opposite elements is sort of like an analogy to the way you reconcile the opposite elements. So when you look at a piece of art and it really hits you well, like you're projecting yourself in it, you become like one with the art piece, and it's kind of like hopeful in a way. Like if the art can unify itself, unify those differing elements in itself, then you can reconcile yourself. That's sort of like the thing. So that's chapter 1. Now following from that, it's kind of like how does that apply to human beings, you know? And let's see. So like one of the, you know, in happy children, the marriage of past values and present incidents takes place easily. There are few obstructions to overcome, few wounds to heal, few conflicts to resolve. In mature persons, the reverse is the case. Accordingly, the achievement of complete unison is rare, but when it occurs, it is on a deeper level and with a fuller content of meaning. So it's kind of like saying that the more history, the more you have to work with. The more possibility for greater union there is. The younger you are, the less you've experienced, the less ups and downs you've gone through, the less you have to work with in a way. So in a way, like age is sort of conductive to art. Not to say that young people cannot create good art, but you know, age and experience is a positive thing. Okay, so another point is like, you know, human beings excel in complexity and minuteness and differentiations. There are more opportunities for resistance and tension, more drafts upon experimentation and invention, therefore more novelty in action, greater range of depth of insight. Like what he's saying here is, like a simple creature, like it's just a unicell organism, for them to be out of sync and in sync with their environment actually requires it could require a very simple cellular function. Whereas human beings, being the complex creatures that we are, you know, holding this human brain, which is one of the most complex things in the universe, like our ability to find multi-layered reconciliations, like we're just so complex that, you know, it's kind of like, this makes, like what I'm saying makes sense, but it's like, okay, how am I reconciled with my, the death of a parent when I'm looking at this painting that is just colors? You know, how does that directly transfer? But I think what he's saying is, because our differentiations, because we're so sophisticated, a lot of the things that we find in ourselves, like, there's a lot of room to, for kind of these indirect and subtle reconciliations. So in a way, like, you can look at a painting and you can be like, yeah, that's what I experienced, even though, you know, it's not directly what you experience. It's sort of abstracted in a way. Okay, so what do you need for the active expression? So what I will talk about basically is like how he breaks down the active expression and how that expression works. So he gives the analogy of like the wine press and like juice. You know, you need the wine press, you need grapes to express juice. It's not like it's something, it's not the wine, it's not the grapes per se, it's not the wine press per se, it's something combining the both. So in this vein, he's saying that it takes two things. It takes an internal emotion and like an internal impulse. That's one of the things. And the second is like resisting objects, the environment, to constitute like a full expression. So like, you know, if you break it down into three elements, the first is like you need some kind of past experience or something inside, which comes from past experience, that you want to express. And the second is that expression needs to come in contact with some kind of objective reality. Some objective reality of the medium that you're working with, whatever the medium is, whether it's writing, poetry, you know, touch designer, whatever. And then the third part of, I guess all this is like when those things combine, what happens? What happens to the object and what happens to the viewer? You know. Okay. So I apologize for putting these quotes like this. I'm going to read them out loud because I think they're important and they're not. I'm just going to read them and then I'll comment on them. All right, if that's all right. So about about past experiences. Like elements that issue from prior experience are stirred into action in fresh desires, impulsions, and images. These proceed from the subconscious, not in cold or in shapes that identify with particulars of the past, not in chunks or lumps, but fused in the fire of internal commotion. They do not seem to come from the self because they issue from a self not consciously known. Hence, by a just myth, the inspiration is attributed to a god or the muse. He's basically saying, like, the stuff from past experience. Is it open?
Thanks. Hey.
Excellent. So, like, what he's basically saying is that, like, the impulse that comes from within to create something, or whatever comes from within, it's not necessarily like linked. It doesn't have to be necessarily linked to a specific experience. It could be like a combination of experiences lead to something, and it may not look direct. But like what he's saying is that when there is an impulse to create, when there's an impulse to be inspired, it comes from something in your past. It may not be like one thing, it could be 10 things, but it could be, you know, but it is it is very distinctly linked to your past. When excitement about a subject matter goes deep, it stirs up a store of attitudes and meaning derived from prior experience. They are aroused into activity and become conscious thoughts and emotions, emotionalized images. To be set on fire by a thought or scene is to be inspired. So it's kind of like he's talking about, you know, like it's kind of like you have these experiences, you absorb them, and they go through some kind of gestation in your subconscious, and then they boil up as like images. They boil up as emotional images, you know, like inspiration. The act of expression that constitutes a work of art is a construction in time, not an instantaneous emission. So what he's talking about, like, he's talking about the gestation experience, and like this means more than the time it takes for the painter to transfer his imaginative conception to canvas and for the sculptor to complete his chipping of marble. It means the expression of the self through a medium constituting the work of art is a prolonged interaction with something issuing from the self with objective conditions. A process in which both of them acquire a form and order they did not first possess. So, like, he's saying, like, expression takes time, and he's not talking about the time it takes for you to, like, paint something, or like the time it takes for you to master material. It takes time to, like, on the one hand, digest experiences and have them come up into some kind of like unique inspiration that you need to pursue artistically. But secondly, like, it also takes time to work through that. Like, that in itself is not enough. You have to sort of work through these ideas that come up on their own. Okay, so we have the expression of, we have like the past experience, and sort of the second element is resistance. Actually, if I can draw this on the board. So you got past experience and inspiration, at least inspiration, and it's like objective reality / material. If I had to draw it on a diagram, it would pretty much look like this. Your past experiences lead to inspiration. Your inspiration grapples with the objective reality of your medium, whatever it is, and those two together are expression. You know, so this, in a way, like the grappling of these together is what's like kind of resistances that you need. It's kind of like working out. You need weights to build your muscles, or you need body weights or whatever. So like the inspiration is initial. Inflamed inner material, like inspiration, must find objective fuel upon which to feed. Through the interaction of the fuel with material already afire, the refined and formed product comes into existence. The act of expression is not something that supervenes upon an expression already complete. So what that means is, like, the inspiration itself is not enough. It's not like you get the inspiration and it's done. You know, like, you have the inspiration and that's just the first step. You have to work through it. It is a carrying forward to completion of an inspiration by means of objective material of perception imagery. So like, you gotta work through it. You gotta bring it forward. That impulsion cannot lead to expression save when it is thrown into commotion and turmoil. Unless there is compression, there is nothing expressed. The turmoil marks the place where inner impulse and contact with the environment meet and create a ferment. So you're gonna tell like the language is pretty like old-timey. Like a lot of words, you don't hear this anymore. Ferment is like, well, I think ferment is like the fermentation or something like that. But so we're here it's kind of run into another idea that, this alone, like he's talking about a third thing that comes. And this is pressure. Like when he says that unless there's compression, nothing is expressed. He's talking about to generate indispensable excitement, there must be something at stake, something momentous and uncertain, like the outcome of a battle or the prospect of a harvest. A sure thing does not arouse us emotionally. So like when you think of like indigenous peoples when they did the war dance or like the rain dance, it wasn't for no reason. They didn't do it for fun. They did it because like they were facing like existential conditions. And I think he's transferring this idea over to the creation of all art, And it's kind of like in the creation of all art, it's like you need some skin in the game. If you're just by yourself taking art classes, doing watercolor landscapes, you can create something nice. But like I think he's talking about art in like the grandest possible way, like in the most existential possible way, which is like you have to put something of yourself. So for instance, like let's just say I suffered the death of like a parent or something early in life, and like it's it's affected my entire life. Like what he's saying is that you have to use that. You have to use that, and not just it affects me. It affects me in a negative way. It affects me from achieving what I want because like of these holes that it's created in my personality. What he's saying is that like art is a way of taking all that energy and like expressing it, not just for the sake of expressing it or creating art, but it's also for the sake of healing yourself. Like if you have to make art in a way to you need it as much as it needs to be made. Like there's an impulsion, but that impulsion is not just like something that you want to generate for generation's sake, but it's for the sake of like you need to do it because otherwise you'll die. In a way, you'll die in a certain way, or you'll be smaller as a personality. So creation of art leads to the maximal expansion of personality, which is the implication of it. So through doing art, you like fix yourself. Like it's almost internal and it's objective external. So like you kind of go into yourself and you go outside. It's kind of like one movement, both directions. Okay. The primitive expression of work. So now he's going to talk about like the process of actually working with your material. The primitive and raw material of experience needs to be reworked in order to secure artistic expression. Oftentimes the need is greater for cases of inspiration than other cases. So again, the idea of like the inspiration is not the end thing. The inspiration is just the beginning, and it's the contact of inspiration with the medium that you're working in and the back and forth that goes with that sort of creates the work of art. In this process, the emotion called out by the original material is modified as it comes attached to the new material. This fact gives us the clue to the nature of aesthetic emotion. And when he's talking about aesthetic emotion, he's talking about like the emotion you have when you're making something meaningful, as well as the emotion the viewer has when looking at something that you've made. And if they take away, just say they really get it, like the two of those things together are the aesthetic emotion. With respect to physical materials that enter into the formation of a work of art, everyone knows that they must undergo change. Marble must be chipped, pigments must be laid on canvas, words must be put together. It is not so generally recognized that a similar transformation takes place on the side of inner materials. Images, observations, memories, and emotions, they are also progressively reformed. They too must be administered. So just the same idea. Like when you take an inspiration and you jam it into whatever medium you're working with, not only is the medium modified, but your initial idea is modified too. It's like a dual modification take place, internal and external. What most of us lack in order to be an artist is not the inceptive emotion, nor is it technical skill and execution. It is the capacity to work a vague idea and emotion over in terms of some definite medium. Think about that. That's he's basically saying that what stands between a person who has like a lot of barriers in artistic expression and cannot do that versus a person who has no barrier and is a full artist in the full sense of the word is not an inceptive emotion. It's not like impulsion. Most people want to create stuff, or a lot of people have ideas, they just can't do it. But it's also not about technical skill. It's about like the capacity to work those two together. It's kind of like the holding the space for those two things to work itself out and holding like the time, to work those things out. We're expressing a kind of dalcomania, which I looked up, means the process of transferring designs from a prepared paper to a glass or porcelain, so like a kind of a stencil work. If expressing were just like kind of stencil work, or a conjuring of a rabbit out of a place where it lay hid, artistic expression would be a comparatively simple matter. But between conception and bringing to birth, there lies a long period of gestation. During this period, the inner material emotion is as much transformed through acting and acted upon by objective material as the latter undergoes modification when it becomes a medium of expression. So that's fine, but you might ask, what about stuff like, you ever heard the story of Rocky, Sylvester Stallone writing Rocky? Basically, like, he wrote the whole thing in one night, and then he went out and sold it and became the greatest star of his time, this kind of stuff. And it was all in one. You always hear these ideas, like Picasso locked himself in his studio for a whole weekend and then he invented Cubism, And it seems like stuff that just happens like this. So John Dewey would say, in terms of spontaneity is the result of long periods of activity, or else it is empty, not to be an active expression. So, spontaneity is not like, it's kind of like when a fruit is ripe from a tree, it takes a long time to be ripe, but when it's ripe, it just takes a touch to knock down. That's the idea of spontaneity. Spontaneity is not like creating something out of nothing with no context, with spending only like a very limited time. Spontaneity only happens when there's a long period of working with the material. So he says, when the new center of energy has been subconsciously incubated so long as to be just ready to burst in the flower, hands off is the only word for us. It must burst forth unaided. So here he's talking about, if you're going to do something spontaneous, you incubate something for a long time, and then it's almost like you're not doing it yourself. You're not like, oh, I'm gonna create this spontaneously. I'm just gonna do it now. It's like it happens on its own. You have no control over it, really. You can bring its conditions, but in the end, when it comes out, when things come out, when you recognize things come out as spontaneous, it's very much the case that it happens through the person. It's not that person's particular genius did it. And in the same vein, the direct effort of will and wit of itself never gave birth to anything that is not mechanical. Their function is necessary, but it's to let loose allies that exist outside their scope. So what he's saying here is your conscious ability to think about things, to analyze things, to plan things, to do this, it is a very vital element of who you are, what you do artistically, but in itself, if you only rely on that, it's just mechanical. The ingredient must come from what is below the area of consciousness. The fundamental, the seed of what you're doing must come from below that. And sort of at the end, it's kind of like you're just going along for the ride. And your conscious mind is sort of like you're the general. It's not the emperor. The emperor issues the order, the general executes them. For my own experience, my own experience about this is, when I'm doing, for instance, when I'm doing one of my light pieces, I do it on Arduino, so I open the IDE, and a lot of times I'm thinking all right, well, I'm going to do something that looks like a white flower, just say, and then I'll save the sketch to be whiteflower.ino, and then maybe 2 minutes later, I'll find something very interesting that does not look like white flower. The whole thing turns red, for instance. And I'll go down this path, and it'll turn to something else. At the end of it, this file is named white flower, but it's actually a red tree or something, you know, like which is why like all my sketches are completely like named differently from what it's very hard for me to find my own sketches on my computer because like they're all named completely differently. But it's kind of like this thing, you start with this intent, but it becomes something else. So I guess, you know, in terms of practical advice, it's sort of like if you have the choice to follow between your, oh, this is what I set off to do, versus like, this is what I want to do, you know, it's kind of like, this is what I set off to do versus this is what I feel should be done. I guess one thing he would keep in mind, what he would say is keep in mind like where the energy is versus what you want it to be. And if you have to make a choice, do not go by what you consciously think it should be. You know what I mean? I think we all face those kind of tensions and choices when creating work. So it's like go with the risk. And it's kind of riskier to go with how you feel because in a way that's way more unknown. It's more unknown and you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Whereas if you go by what you planned, you'll know what's going to happen. You know, everyone knows what's going to happen. You know, but that's not the way to greater expression, is what John Dewey is saying. Okay, now we're sort of headed in the area. So we've reached this area of expression. Now, the next section is going to be talking about how expression reaches, you know, other people. And the mechanics of expression and how it actually works. So the mechanics are emotion. And it's like a two-way street. Thank you. Thanks for coming. So the fact that art is selective is universally recognized. It is so because the role of emotion in the act of expression. So art is selective. What does that mean? That means that like if I am like drawing a still life or something like that, just say I'm like drawing Barack or something like that, I can't draw him because it's like it's reality, and I have like a pen and it's like a line on a paper. There's no way I can draw him. I can only choose like what most expresses who he is right now in this position. So I like might sketch his head and the way he's putting his arm and all that, and that might give a feeling of what I'm seeing. But in itself, art has to be selective because whatever you do is not as good as reality. Reality or the emotion or your idea will always be better, you know. But selection works because of emotion. Okay, so he's going to give his theory on how emotion works, sort of in a flow. So he says any predominant mood automatically excludes all that is uncongenial with it. An emotion is more effective than any deliberate argument could be. It reaches out tentacles for that which feeds it and carries it to completion. Only when an emotion dies or is broken into dispersed fragments can material to which it is alien enter consciousness. What's he saying here? He's basically saying, like, a person under any emotional mood is, unless you're, if you present someone something with like a variety of different things, the person with a certain emotion will select what is most allied with their emotion. If they're in love, they're going to look in the world and see love. If they're hatred, they're going to look out in the world and see hatred. Like a person under the effect of emotion can only see that in the world. And expression. Like discharge is you fly straight to the object. Expression is the energy to go to the object is the same, but like the path is very different. The path goes through different things. So this transformation is the very essence of the change that takes place in every natural or original emotional impulse when it takes the indirect road of expression rather than the direct road of discharge. Irritation may be let go of like an arrow directed at the target to produce some kind of outer change in the outer world. But having an outer effect is very different from the ordered use of objective conditions to give objective fulfillment to the emotion. So it's kind of like a baby feels sad, it cries. That's not art. But a baby feels sad, and, well, I mean not baby, but like a person feels sad and writes a song and sings it and expresses that emotion. That's art. That's expression. Discharge and expression, they're two different things. So like, you know, there's like the emotion, and then there's two levels to this. There's an emotion, and then there's like sort of the fulfillment of the art piece. There's like, You know, for instance, like what he's saying is a work may be much more tragic, yet lead us to with emotional fulfillment instead of irritation. So like when you're watching like a really tragic play, the events are very tragic and you wouldn't want them to happen to you. You wouldn't want any of those things to actually happen to you. But in the context of seeing that play, those tragic events actually lead to an emotion of more fulfillment. So what he's saying is like, in a way, you could watch something happy and be completely unfulfilled, versus you could watch something sad and feel completely fulfilled. So the aesthetic emotion is more about the act of fulfillment than the deep level fulfillment of that emotion, rather than the surface level fulfillment. You know, like the difference between, like for me at least, I started to watch horror movies, and I really like the horror movies. Well, the horror movies that are very scary to me, the real scary ones, but the things that leave me happy at the end are like the stories where the ghost or the demon or evil. It happens because something it's like something in the actual situation. Like for instance, you guys watch the movie Babadook. Super good Australian horror movie, excellent horror movie. But it's basically a psychological movie about tragedy and how tragedy can lead to like the disintegration of personality, and that disintegration is epitomized in form of demon. In other words, it's talking about something true. Versus I watched a movie called The Conjuring the other day, and like that movie, it's like the ghost is just placed there to scare the audience. There's no other reason for it. There's no real logic for it. It doesn't. It's almost like these things are floating in space, unconnected, and it's like this thing that just happens there, you know. And then I feel unfulfilled watching that, and I think it's stupid. I'm actually less scared of it. I'm scared on a jump scare surface level, but deeply I'm less disturbed by it because I'm like, oh, that'll never happen. That's so stupid, you know. Okay, so the determination of the right incident, of the right place, of like the right proportion, the right tones and all that, that help unify things as a whole, and he's always talking about like the whole versus the part here, is accomplished by emotion. Not every emotion, however, can do this work, but only one informed by material that is grasped and gathered. So like, it's not just like what are the specific emotions that you need to use to bring a work to completion, to have like to lead to a feeling of fulfillment. It's not in that particular sense. It's like that must come up when you're wrestling with the work, when you're grappling with the work. It must come from within your direct contact with the work, not from something external. Emotion is informed and carried forward when it is spent indirectly in search of material and giving it order, not when it is directly expended. Okay, so this is another, for me it's another difficult sentence, but I think what he's trying to say is like when you're grappling with work and carrying it forward and you're using that emotion, spending it direct, like you have to use that emotion into the work wherever your stage of grappling with the work is. Like if you're stuck on a particular project, it's not a particular problem, it's not like you can use that emotion and start something new. You have to sort of like grapple through where you left off in a way, you know, like, I don't know, this is my interpretation, but I don't know if that's completely true, but you know, the idea is like when you're grappling with the material of the work, everything in that work must be within your sort of wrestling within it. So like, if you do not succeed at this, you know, what he describes as, you know, bad art is basically two things. One is contrivance, and the second is inconsistency. On contrivance, he says, if one examines the reason why certain works of art offend us, one is likely to find the cause that there is no personally felt emotion guiding and selecting guiding the selecting and assembling of materials presented. We derive the impression that the artist is trying to regulate by conscious intent the nature of the emotion aroused. We are irritated by feeling that he's manipulating materials to secure an effect decided upon in advance. So it's kind of like I don't know, anyone watched The Last Jedi? Anyone like The Last Jedi or anything? If you do, we can disagree later, but I think one of the reasons why there was such a strong like backlash against it is that everything in that movie was either like a throwback to the original series, like, oh my god, R2-D2, oh my god. Like, everything was sort of contrived to sell Disney products or to like give the audience what the producers thought the audience wanted, rather than tell the story in itself, you know? And I think that's what separates, like, you know, like The Last Jedi from like Return of the Jedi or something like that, where it's sort of like, in Return of the Jedi, I think why people love Star Wars so much is like, the whole plot sort of succeeded by its own internal forces. Like if you look at the climax of Return of the Jedi, and you know, Luke Skywalker defeats Darth Vader, cuts off his hand, and and then the Emperor, like, you know, telling him to come to the dark side, and then he says, no, I'm not going to fight. The Emperor, like, electrocutes him, and he's almost going to die. Like, there's nothing good about that situation with Luke Skywalker, and then all of a sudden, Darth Vader, by himself, converts to the light side and like kills the Emperor. Like, evil defeats itself on its own accord, which is a very deep mythological theme. But it's like that whole structure is set up by the things in the movie itself. It's not externally placed by a producer, even though it was. You know what I mean? Okay, so closely allied but a little different is inconsistency. Either the maker had no experience that was emotionally toned, or although having an outset of felt emotion was not sustained, and a succession of unrelated emotions dictated the work. It's kind of like saying that you might start with a particular idea, but as you're working through it, you have another idea that does not completely jive with your first idea, and they sort of mix together and they conflict. I think we've all seen works of art like this. Like, they try to achieve one thing, but they're trying to do too many things at once. And as a result, all those things conflict with each other, and you create like an inconsistent jumble rather than a coherent whole, like that. Okay, I went through a lot of material just now. I only have one more slide. Maybe we can open up to questions afterwards. So the last thing is perception versus identification. It's like, you know, John Dewey is all about like continuity versus isolation, the whole versus like partiality, and he's all about art as like a whole thing moving at once. You're looking at this whole thing, like a whole universe, a whole thing. You do, like, good art is what's whole, bad art is what is apart, partial, fragmented, isolated, all this kind of stuff. So he applies this to perception too. Like, people who cannot see art, like people who appreciate art, generally speaking, see that art in a continuity of things, whether it's their own emotions or whether it's the world around them or their history of art. So generally speaking, the more you know about art, the better it is, although sometimes that's not true either. But he's saying that to see and perceive is more than recognize. It does not identify something from the present, disconnect from the past, but rather the past is carried into the present so as to expand and deepen the content of the latter. Like, merely identifying is like a nod and passing on, or it's a passing moment in isolation. It marks a dead spot in experience that is merely filled in. The extent to which the process of living in any day or hour is reduced to labeling situations, events, and objects as so-and-so, as a mere succession, marked a cessation of life that is a conscious experience. In this, he kind of alludes to, like, you know, what I said about if you know more about art, the better like you're able to experience it. The reverse situation of this case is like art critics who, like, you know, they go to a museum, they're like, oh yeah, that's abstract, oh that's cubism, oh that's it. But there's a barrier to them. Their act of labeling everything, identify everything, like with like categories, that in itself like sort of stops them from appreciating, like, you know, what that thing actually is, the uniqueness about what it actually is. Okay, that was a lot of material. That's sort of the last of my slides. I'm actually surprised I got through them so quickly. It's 12:52, we got like 8 minutes left. This is my first time doing it, so if I was a little bit incoherent, I apologize, but I'm, you know, wondering if there's any questions or anything about anything at all.
He talks about universality and mentions the current state of a person.
Yeah.
Does he talk about disruption of state? Like art's ability to disrupt your state? If you approach a particular work and you're full of love or hatred or annoyance or whatever it is, not just the ability to project that back to you, but to completely change your state.
I mean, it's so obvious what you're saying is true, you know.
Because some things resonate and some things force something on you.
Yes. I think if I was going to just, you know, run that question through things that I read, I would say, like, it's kind of like the person is like almost like a minefield of like emotions and reconciliations and something like that. So like, in a way, vulnerability is not the right word. I would say susceptibility is the right word. So it's like if you're really angry, but inside there's something that's susceptible to disruption, and you see something full of love that disrupts your angry emotion. He doesn't really talk about this, but that is like, yeah, that's definitely true. You know.
Can you expand a little bit more on this last concept that you have here, like continuity versus isolation? Like, what does he mean by the sense of continuity?
It's kind of like the sense of continuity is kind of like this whole structure here, which is like how art works, which is like art works because it connects to the past of the artist and the present of the objective reality into this like piece of art, and that piece of art goes out into the world, and through perception by the viewer, it connects to the viewer because of the viewer's past experiences, and I guess art that sort of takes into account all this kind of stuff, or I'm not exactly sure how to run it through this model, but like it's kind of like art that's kind of like what is whole comes from a past and is going somewhere else. It's not just a experience isolated in time that has no other meaning other than how it exists right now. Like nothing is in isolation. I think what he's trying to say is the more you see stuff in isolation, the further from artistic expression you will be. Versus the more you see stuff like in wholeness with everything else, the more closer to expression, the more fuller your expression will be. Stuff like that. And to give a martial arts example, although this is not directly applicable to the stuff we're doing, it's like if you're like throwing a punch or something like that, and you do this, it only has so much power. Whereas if you move as one whole thing with your arm attached and everything else, and your whole body moves, that's like kind of powerful. And I think like that analogy does work with art. I can't really articulate how, but I don't know if you guys feel that it's true. Like
It's also the fact that it's a sequence of movements and not just one in isolation.
Yes.
You'll be down on the floor.
Yeah, exactly. Like a chain of things. Like, sorry.
Oh no, this is next. You can finish up.
I was just gonna say like for instance, here's an example, right? I have a friend who's he's like the most unsophisticated person I know, and I brought him to MoMA one day, and he looked at like a Picasso. He's like, oh my 6-year-old can do this, He's viewing it in isolation. He's viewing it in isolation without any kind of eyes. But if you look at that Picasso in terms of what it meant, and the history of what it meant, and all this stuff, you can appreciate it much more. Not saying that you can't appreciate Picasso without understanding the history of it, but it's kind of like when you see something in continuity, it's that much more beautiful. And I think a lot of works of art now, when you look at it now in the isolation versus continuity is also something like that. It plagues museums too, right? Because when you take something away from its context, you put it in a museum. It makes no sense. Like they take those ancient Greek sculptures from the Parthenon or whatever, and they put it into the London Royal Museum or whatever. Like you see it in a museum context, you're like, wow, that's great. But it's surrounded by all this other stuff that looks like it. Whereas if you see it in ancient Greece and you are part of a ritual ceremony and it's high up there in like the temple, like it's lit by like candle flame and it's not lit by like halogen light, the whole thing will be different. So it's kind of like I don't know. I would say that experience is more continuity in terms of its entrenchment with life itself, like with the experience of life itself. Like what John Dewey is trying to say in the entire book is basically like art was not always just belonging to museums and galleries and stuff like that. There was a time when art was inseparable from life, and it's like what we consider the distinction between like technological art and fine art is like a modern distinction. Like back in the day, if you were like a craftsman of like a tribe or something like that, and you created like spears, like beautiful spears, like those were like now you put them in galleries, they're like a work of art. But back then they were just sort of tools. And back then like paintings were used in religious ceremonies. Like back then there was no separate, like art and life were exactly one thing. It's the modern thing that had them separated. So I think he's trying to say like this continuity versus isolation thing. It's like we can't go back to those days, of course, but it's like keeping that in mind. Keeping in mind the context of things. Yeah. Like for instance, like just to give you an example from my own personal experience, like when I do my light paintings, for instance, like I don't just see it as LEDs on paper. I see it as me continuing a tradition of exploration of light since the Renaissance, since before that, since like that leads from Rembrandt to the Impressionists to like Rothko to like Turrell to this present age. Like I see my work, I like to look at my work in a lineage of continuity of people who came before me, and I build on their insights. I take their insights and I add just a little bit on top of it for the next person. The next person after me will add just a little bit on top of that. It's like the continuity of human experience, you know. And I feel like when you live like that, like it's more meaningful, and also like that meaning somehow expresses itself through your work. I don't know how, but it expresses through your work, like the mindset you have with it.
Yeah. What does he say about like what the word artist means? Like there's something in there before, like what is a true, like something true artist? I'm curious what he means by that definition.
True artist.
Or not even just art, or just
Okay.
like the word itself. Especially since you were talking about how in the past people like art was part of everyday life. So does that mean everyone was artists? Was that everyone experiencing art, everyone making art? Like it's a big question.
I don't really recall this being explicitly like tackled, but I do think like most of the stuff speaks to it. I think what he would say is like what is considered art is a modern invention, and like in the past, like I'm not really sure, man. I'm sorry, I don't really know. I'd have to really read it again and with that question.
Okay, could you go back a few slides? There's one thing that I thought was interesting. More.
Tell me when to stop.
Keep going. Okay, it was something about like something like the weight of something, or like the weight of a piece of art.
The weights. Well, okay. Here, I'm gonna try to predict what you're asking for. Here's a good question. We're just. I'm gonna wrap up after this one comment. All right, I'm gonna wrap up after this one comment. Like, for instance, I learned figure drawing, right? And you can draw a figure, the surface, all that sort of stuff. But when I learned how to draw, like a lot of times the instructor would say you draw behind the figure. You draw behind the figure. You draw the stuff you can't even see. And even though you can't see it and you're trying to draw it, it's a little ridiculous. But your act of doing that, of trying to see behind the figure, creates a weight that if you just tried to draw what you could see, you wouldn't see it.
Yeah.
You wouldn't create it. It's that creation of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like seeing something as a whole. Like you seeing something as a whole leads to weight, seeing something partially leads to less weight.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, that's it, guys. Thank you very much for coming and listening.
Will you share the slide deck?
Sure, yeah, I'll show you the slide deck. Sure.